When you picture ancient Rome, you probably see the white marble. You see the Colosseum gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, the pristine togas of the Senate, and the disciplined legions marching in perfect unison. Hollywood has spent a century convincing us that Rome was a civilization of clean lines, grand philosophy, and heroic order. But that is a lie. If you were actually dropped into the heart of Rome during the height of the empire, you wouldn't be marveling at the architecture. You would probably be vomiting. You would be choking on smoke, stepping over human waste, and frantically checking your belt to make sure your purse hasn't been cut yet. Because the real Rome wasn't the marble temples on the hills. The real Rome was the valley between them. It was a place called the Subura, and for the vast majority of Romans, life here isn't a heroic epic. It is a horror movie. Welcome to the Subura, the most dangerous, crowded, and filthy slum in the history of the ancient world. This is where the empire actually lives. While the 1% are up on the Palatine Hill eating grapes and plotting world domination, the other 99% are crammed into this swampy, suffocating district, fighting just to survive the night. It is a place where the police don't go, where fire is a daily weather forecast, and where the most powerful man in the world, Julius Caesar, learned how to fight dirty. To understand Rome, you have to ignore the statues and look at the sewers. And in the Subura, the sewer is the street. The first thing that hits you is the smell. It is a physical wall of stench that no amount of movie magic can replicate. Rome has no municipal garbage collection service for the poor. There are no trucks coming to haul away the trash. So, where does the waste of 1 million people go? It goes out the window, quite literally. Walking through the Subura means navigating a literal minefield of excrement, rotting food, and dead animals that residents simply heave out of their apartments. The city is essentially a giant open-air septic tank cooking in the Italian heat. And speaking of apartments, forget the airy villas you see in the history books. In the Subura, the skyline is dominated by the insulae. These are the ancient equivalent of skyscrapers, towering apartment blocks that rise 6, 7, sometimes 8 stories into the air. But these aren't built of steel and reinforced concrete. They're built of mud, brick, and cheap timber, held together by hope and greed. The insulae are death traps. They're owned by wealthy slumlords who live far away in their safe marble mansions. These landlords, men like the infamous Crassus, the richest man in Rome, operate on a business model that would make a modern scam artist blush. They build these towers as high as possible using the cheapest materials available to pack in as many rent-paying tenants as they can. The walls are paper thin. You can hear your neighbors snoring, arguing, or plotting a murder through the plaster. The lower floors are built of brick and are somewhat safe, so they cost a fortune. But as you go up, the materials get lighter and cheaper. The top floors, the attic spaces where the poorest citizens live, are basically piles of kindling wood waiting for a spark. And in a city lit entirely by oil lamps and open flames, that spark isn't an if, it's a when. Living in the Subura means living with the constant gnawing fear of gravity. These buildings collapse all the time. It is a regular Tuesday afternoon occurrence. You might be walking to the market to buy some questionable bread when suddenly a 6-story building down the block just gives up and crumbles into the street, burying hundreds of families in seconds. The dust cloud settles, the screaming starts, and the rest of the city just keeps moving. There is no emergency response team coming to save you. The Roman vigiles, often called the first firefighters, are mostly there to stop the fire from spreading to the rich neighborhoods. If your building falls, you are on your own. And here is the darkest part of the Roman real estate game. Sometimes the collapse is part of the plan. There are stories of landlords who wait for a building to burn or fall, then swoop in to buy the charred land from the desperate neighbors for pennies, only to rebuild another death trap the next week. Crassus notoriously had his own private fire brigade. They would show up to a burning building and refuse to put out the fire until the owner agreed to sell the property to Crassus at a rock-bottom price. Once the contract was signed, only then would they turn on the water hoses. In the Subura, disaster isn't a tragedy, it's a business opportunity. But let's say your building doesn't collapse today. You still have to survive the streets. The Subura is the economic engine of Rome, which means it is deafeningly loud. Ancient Rome has no zoning laws. A blacksmith hammering iron might be next door to a school, which is next door to a brothel, which is underneath a sleeping family. The noise is a constant, maddening roar of wagons, shouting merchants, barking dogs, and crying babies. The poet Martial famously complained that he couldn't sleep in Rome because of the noise, writing that the laughter of the passing crowd wakes me. And the crowd is unavoidable. The population density here is astronomical. Imagine the packed floor of a rock concert, but it never ends, and everyone is carrying a knife. You don't walk through the Subura, you shove your way through it. In this chaos, privacy is a myth. The people of the Subura live their entire lives in public. Because the apartments are tiny, dark, and filled with smoke from cooking fires, nobody wants to stay inside. The street is the living room. It's the kitchen. It's the bathroom. Most residents of the Subura don't have kitchens in their apartments because lighting a fire inside a wooden box is suicidal, so they eat out. This gave rise to the thermopolia, the ancient ancestors of the fast food joint. These are stone counters opening onto the street, serving cheap wine, watered-down vinegar, and bowls of unidentifiable stew. This is where the deals happen. This is where the gossip spreads. If you want to know who is sleeping with whom or which senator is about to be stabbed, you don't go to the Senate floor. You go to a thermopolium in the Subura. But beneath the noise and the grime, there is a pulse of dangerous power here. The Subura isn't just a place for the poor, it is the political laboratory of Rome. This is where Julius Caesar grew up. Unlike most of the elite who lived on the Palatine Hill, Caesar's family home was here, in the muck. He walked these filthy streets as a child, he learned the slang, he saw how the gangs operated, and when he decided to take over the world, he didn't just use the legions, he used the Subura. He understood that while the Senate had the money, the Subura had the numbers. If you could control the mob in the Subura, you could shut down the city, you could riot, you could burn, you could terrify the old men in their togas until they gave you whatever you wanted. This brings us to the gangs. If you think organized crime is a modern invention, think again. The Subura is run by collegia, technically guilds or neighborhood associations, but in reality they are mafia families. They control the streets. They run protection rackets. If a shopkeeper wants to sell his olive oil without his shop accidentally catching fire, he pays the local gang boss. The most famous of these gangsters is a man named Clodius Pulcher, a patrician who rebranded himself as a man of the people. Clodius turns the Subura into his personal army. He recruits the gladiators, the thieves, and the desperate, organizing them into hit squads. Politics in the late Republic isn't about debate, it is about whose gang can beat the other gang to a pulp in the forum. There are days when the Subura gangs flood the voting assemblies, smashing the voting urns and physically throwing their political opponents off the speaking platforms. This isn't democracy, it's a street brawl with a fancy name. And it all starts here, in the shadow of the rickety apartment blocks. However, all of this, the noise, the crowds, the collapsing buildings, that is just the daytime. When the sun goes down, the Subura undergoes a terrifying transformation. You have to understand that ancient Rome has no streetlights, none. When the sun sets, the city is plunged into a darkness so absolute it is hard for modern humans to comprehend. The only light comes from the moon or the occasional flicker of an oil lamp in a window. And in this pitch-black labyrinth, the predators come out. The night belongs to the muggers, the cloak stealers, and the murderers. A wealthy Roman named Juvenal wrote that walking through the Subura at night with a candle is essentially begging to be robbed. He joked that if you go out to dinner without writing your last will and testament first, you are being negligent. The rich, if they are forced to travel at night, move like military convoys. They are surrounded by huge, muscle-bound slaves carrying torches and cudgels, creating a bubble of light and violence to keep the Subura at bay. But if you are a normal person, you are prey. You hug the walls, you listen for footsteps, you pray that the shadow up ahead is just a stray dog and not a gang of bored youths looking for someone to beat up for sport. There is no police force to call. The Emperor Augustus eventually established the Vigilus, the Night Watch, but their primary job is to spot fires and runaway slaves. They are not crime stoppers. In fact, if you scream for help in the Subura at night, most people will just bolt their doors tighter. Getting involved means getting stabbed. So the streets become a free fire zone. Bodies are often found in the morning, stripped of their clothes and dumped in the gutters, just another piece of refuse to be stepped over by the morning crowd. It creates a psychological toll that is hard to measure. The people here are living in a state of hypervigilance, permanently stressed, knowing that their home could burn down or they could be murdered for their sandals at any moment. And yet, despite the horror, there is a strange, vibrant life here. The Subura is the most diverse place in the world. Walk down a single alleyway and you will hear Greek, Aramaic, Gallic, Egyptian, and Latin. It is a melting pot of immigrants, freed slaves, and soldiers. It is the place where foreign cults take root before they become mainstream religions. Christianity, for example, didn't start in the palaces. It started in places like this, in the dark, cramped rooms of the Subura, whispered among people who were desperate for a god that actually cared about the poor. It is a place of vice, yes. The Subura is famous for its brothels, which are often just a curtain hanging across a doorway in a bakery. It is famous for its gambling dens, where men bet their freedom on a roll of the dice. But it is also a place of resilience. But resilience only gets you so far when the city itself is a tinderbox. The ultimate fate of the Subura and much of Rome is written in its architecture. In 64 AD, the Great Fire of Rome breaks out. It starts near the Circus Maximus, but inevitably, hungry for fuel, it turns toward the wooden slums. The Subura doesn't just burn, it vanishes. The fire rages for 6 days. The narrow streets act as wind tunnels, sucking the flames higher and hotter. People are trapped in the upper stories of the insulae with nowhere to run. The fire breaks that the vigiles try to create by tearing down buildings are useless against the inferno. Legend says Nero fiddled while it burned. Whether that is true or not doesn't matter to the people of the Subura. What matters is that their world, the smelly, loud, dangerous, vibrant world, is turned into ash. When the smoke clears, Nero uses the cleared land not to build better housing for the poor, but to build his golden house, a massive, opulent palace for himself. It is the ultimate gentrification. The poor are pushed further out, into new slums, into new misery, while the rich reclaim the ashes. Today, if you visit Rome, you can walk through the Monte district, which sits where the Subura used to be. It is hip, trendy, and expensive. There are ivy-covered walls and charming cafes where tourists pay €5 for an espresso. The stench is gone. The screaming is gone. The gangs are gone. But if you dig down just a few meters beneath the cobblestones, the bones of the real Rome are still there. The Rome of the Subura. The Rome that wasn't built of marble, but of blood, sweat, and cheap timber. It serves as a reminder that history isn't just about the winners who build the monuments. It's about the millions who lived in the shadows of those monuments, trying to survive a city that was designed to kill them. So, the next time you watch a movie with guys in togas speaking British accents and talking about the glory of the Republic, remember the Subura. Remember the smell. Remember the darkness. And remember that for most people, Rome wasn't a dream. It was a nightmare that they just happened to wake up in every single day.